I'm Scotty. I'm a practicing witch and a professional tarot nerd. And today, I'm a storyteller. And I'm so glad you're here. Spooky season is upon us again. This is another in a series of tales I'm calling the 13 Days of Halloween. Now, I grew up out in the country. When I was growing up, I had myself all kinds of adventures. And some were funny, and others were exciting, and some were spooky and even mysterious. But all of these stories are true, even if they didn't happen. Late one March, I was coming home after a date, and I ran into a bit of car trouble. The trouble is, I'd allowed myself to run out of gas. There I was on the side of the road, and I was worried Daddy would be mad at me, because he'd have to come bring me a gas can. I decided instead of worrying him with that, I'd just walk home from there. It's only 3-4 miles after all. And I'd deal with the gas issue the next day. So I grabbed my trusty flashlight in the car and I set out. And it was a pleasant enough night, but after about a mile or so, I was already tired. And I realized I was not too far from old Mr. George's place. Maybe Mr. George had a phone that I could use, and I'd just go ahead and give Daddy that call. When I got there, I figured Mr. George was home. I saw his old green car there. I was familiar with that car. If you ever got behind Mr. George when he was driving that old green car, you just have to be patient, because he never really seemed to be in any particular hurry. Now, he lived in this old little trailer home behind an old house. That house always looked like it was just about ready to fall in on itself. And I guess I just figured that maybe Mr. George had just got too old to keep that old house up, so that's why he lived in that little trailer home. I first met Mr. George when I was a boy. Seems my granddaddy knew him from way on back, and Granddaddy'd go visit with him from time to time, and one day he took me along for the trip. When we got there for the visit, Mr. George invited us in and offered us a glass of sweet tea, and he and Granddaddy settled in to talk. As they talked about grown-up stuff, I was probably 10, 11 years old at this time, and they were talking about grown-up stuff, and oh, that was so boring. I do remember, though, Mr. George always seemed to be real nice. And it was cozy inside that little trailer home. Everything was tidy. The furniture was old, but it was comfortable, and there were a few shelves filled with books, and there was some art on the walls. There were a few masks from places somewhere out in the world, and there was other stuff hanging there too. I never really could make out what it was. And Mr. George had this old dog too, chunky old basset hound he called Percy. And while we were visiting, Percy waddled up and sniffed at my feet a little bit before he curled up and lay down there. And I leaned over to scritch him on the head a little bit. And on the coffee table there was this big old book, and it was about mysterious places from all over the world. So being bored with all the grown-up talk, I picked up that big old book and started thumbing through it. And there were pictures of Stonehenge and Machu Picchu and the pyramids and Nan Madol and and so many other interesting and fascinating, mysterious places. I got lost in that old book and got to wondering about all the mysterious and strange things in the world. So there I was, late on that March night, on the side of the road next to Mr. George's place. And so I walked around past that old green car towards the back where that trailer home was. And I was hoping he might still be awake. I didn't want to wake him up. I knocked on the door, and there wasn't any answer. There weren't any lights on inside. I figured maybe Mr. George was asleep, but I didn't want to bother him. So as I turned to head back on my trek to the house, I heard this little rustling sound in the yard there, and I turned, and old Percy, the basset hound, was standing there. About jumped out of my socks when I saw him. There he was, just snuffling around. He came up to me, and I said, "What you doing out here, Percy?" And he just looked up at me with those big old brown basset eyes and wagged his tail a little bit. And then he turned and he started waddling his way back towards that old house that was falling in. Well, I thought I would head on my way. I didn't know what Percy was up to, so as I started to turn and go, I heard Percy say, "Woof." So I turned and I looked at him again, and he said, "Woof." And he looked towards that old house. I've been around dogs most of my life, and I always knew that they were more aware and smarter than many people gave them credit for. And when I was growing up, I used to watch that show Lassie on TV. You know the one, that's the one where old Timmy fell in the well every other week or so, and that old smart dog would save the day. Anyway, maybe Percy was trying to tell me something. Maybe Mr. George was hurt or sick. So I went up to old Percy and I said, "Well, Percy, show me what it is." And he took those stumpy little basset legs and he started climbing those old wooden steps up to the back porch of that old house. And I followed him up those old creaking steps. Now the back door of that house was open. That screen door was closed. And old Percy just waddled his way right on through. Seems that the screen on the door was torn there a little bit, and it was just right for Percy to come and go. Now I was wondering if I should go inside when Percy turned and looked at me and he said, "Woof." So I opened that old screen door and it gave this eerie creaking sound, and I went in that darkened house. Now I shined my old trusty flashlight around and I found myself in a kitchen. And it wasn't raggedy and falling apart like you might expect from looking at the outside of the house. From in that kitchen you wouldn't have known how bad off the house was from the outside. The counters were clean, and on the stove you could see where it hadn't been long since somebody cooked dinner over there, and it still smelled so good in that kitchen. My mouth was starting to water. "Mr. George must be a good cook," I said to myself. I figured maybe he was able to keep this part of the house up, and this is just where he did all his cooking. As I was looking around, I heard Percy. He said, "Woof," again, and he was at the doorway out of the kitchen. Turned to go up this little hallway. Well, I followed Percy up that way where he'd stopped at this closed door. At the foot of that door, I could see a golden light kind of shining out a little bit. Percy looked at me again and said, "Woof," and looked back at that door. Well, all right then, let's go. And I opened that door and Percy waddled on in. And inside that room, where it was lit by oil lamps and sconces on the walls, was a nice dining room, a nice table, and looks like Mr. George had laid out a feast. There was ham and greens and peas, potatoes, cornbread. Oh, it smelled so good. And at the head of that table sat Mr. George. And all around that table there were other folks. Looked like they'd all just sat down for dinner, too. Well, that's when Mr. George looked up and he said to me, "Come on in, son. I've been waiting for you." And he waved a hand over at an empty chair to his right there. And he looked at his old dog and he said, "Thank you, Percy." And Percy said, "Woof." He was wagging his tail and he's made his way over to a corner of a room where there was a pile of old quilts there in the corner. And Percy just turned himself around and settled down on those blankets. Well, I was still standing there in that doorway, confused. The only car I'd seen was Mr. George's old green car outside, so where'd all these other people come from? There was a young girl sitting off to Mr. George's left, and he turned to her and he said, "Rebecca, honey, go and crank the phonograph for us." And she said, "Yes, Papa." She stood up and she went over to the side table over there, and she started turning the crank. This old phonograph. Clack, 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 clack. She turned that for a little bit. She pushed a lever on there, and the record started to turn. And the phonograph started to play some old bluegrass music. As Rebecca came back and sat down at the table. And I was still standing there at the door into the kitchen, and Mr. George looks back at me and, "Come on, sit. "Yes, sir." I went over and I sat down there at that table. There with us was Rebecca, an elderly man and a woman, and a couple of younger men and younger women, maybe in their 20s. And they were all wearing older style clothing. Mr. George smiled. He had a very kind smile. He said, "Have some dinner, son. I'm a pretty good cook. I once served in the galley of the RMS Empress of Britain." "Yes, sir," I said. The folks at the table started passing me bowls and dishes, and fixed myself a plate. As the elderly lady to my right poured me a glass of sweet tea, Mr. George said, "I don't have much time left, I reckon. I need to share my story while I can." And as I ate, Mr. George told me his story. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, I was a young man and thought I needed to do my part, so I enlisted. I ended up in the trenches there in France. I experienced boredom and horror in equal measure. But I did my duty. I was injured once, and while recovering in a hospital, I met a British soldier who had been a professor of history, it seems, and I learned more from him about how big the world really is. I returned home after the war in 1919, and I found that the Spanish flu, which had been ravaging the world, had ravaged my home as well. My whole family was dead. My wife, my daughter, my brothers, my mother, my father, all gone. Grief nearly took me then. I signed on to a merchant ship to try to escape that grief, and crawled into a bottle for a while when the ship didn't take me far enough away from it. I ended up in Egypt, of all places, out in the deserts, working with archaeologists. One of those archaeologists, he had found these little dolls in one of the tombs. They're called Shabti dolls. They were all inscribed with spells. At least that's what he told me. I'd never been much of a student in school, but working with him, I managed to learn to read some of those hieroglyphics. And I learned that those spells were intended to animate those dolls in the afterlife to provide help for the occupants of those tombs. Signed on to more ships, and I ended up off the coast of Bermuda on a little tender vessel called the Ready, where William Beebe was doing dives in his bathysphere, the first deep-sea diving vessel. They found things during those dives other than fish. They found a city there beneath the sea. They were able to take photographs, and there were obelisks under the water, covered in inscriptions, pictographs that weren't unlike hieroglyphics. At night, after our work was done on the dives, I whiled away my hours looking at all of those photographs. And they talked about the souls of the dead and how one might converse with them. Now, I'd heard stories of an island called Pohnpei. It's what we call Micronesia now, where the locals spoke of sunken cities, forgotten knowledge. I made my way there on a merchant ship and met this one old man who showed me a carved stone tablet. And on that tablet, he said it talked about opening doorways into the afterlife. I spent some time in Tibet, studied with those monks there, learning to meditate. Those are some people with very disciplined minds. And I had collected all of this knowledge. Made my way through Europe, visiting old libraries and monasteries and universities, finding everything I could, because I was still racked with grief at the loss of everything I had ever held dear. And I thought that I had everything I needed to see my family again. I made my way back home, serving there in the galley on the RMS Empress of Britain. It would have been 1939, I guess. And when I returned home, I collected everything I needed. And I found a way, once a year, as winter turns to spring, and as the earth begins to awaken, I could see my family again. And it has been this way for many years. But I'm old. And I've walked this earth a long time. And I think soon I'll be going to see them. But this story needed to be told. I sat there amazed after Mr. George finished telling me about his life and the things that he had learned. And he smiled at me. And he said, "I think I got an old gas can. Let's see if we can't get you on your way again." And he gave me that old gas can, and I put some gas in the car, and I was thoughtful all the way home, thinking about all the things that Mr. George had told me. And of course I got home late, and I got grounded again. But that was all right. It was well worth that price. Now, it wasn't too long after that I found out that Mr. George had passed away. And I also heard that the coroner had found things in Mr. George's house which inspired him to call in some professors of history and archaeology, call in these professors from the state university. And apparently they boxed all kinds of things up and took them off. I never found out what. I can only imagine the things that Mr. George had collected during his life. And I also imagine that he was once again having dinner with his family. I want to thank y'all for spending some time with me today. I hope you've enjoyed this story about dinner with Mr. George. If you did, please like, subscribe, share, comment. This is Tucker. My name is Scotty. Safe.